OMG. Your soulmate cut someone off after finding out this about you. Listen carefully, because this message is for you, and your heart needs this right now. For a long time, your soulmate believed a version of the story that was never completely true. It wasn't because they wanted to misunderstand you. It wasn't because they were trying to judge you unfairly. It happened because there was someone in their life whose voice carried influence, someone whose opinions were rarely questioned, someone who seemed trustworthy enough that their words were accepted without much investigation. Whenever your name came up, that person always had something to say. Sometimes it sounded like concern. Sometimes it sounded like advice. Sometimes it sounded like a warning. But no matter how it was presented, the result was always the same. A subtle shadow was placed over the way your soulmate saw you. At first, they didn't notice it happening. Human beings often trust familiar voices without realizing how deeply those voices shape their perceptions. And listen to this, your soulmate never imagined they would eventually question that influence. They assumed the information they were receiving was accurate. They assumed the opinions being shared were fair. They assumed there was no reason to doubt them. But life has a strange way of bringing truth into the light when the time is right. Little by little, circumstances created opportunities for your soulmate to see you directly instead of through someone else's perspective. They began observing things for themselves. They noticed the way you interacted with people. They noticed how you handled challenges. They noticed how you responded when things didn't go your way. And your heart needs this right now because what they saw completely contradicted what they expected to see. Instead of finding someone selfish, they found someone considerate. Instead of finding someone dishonest, they found someone sincere. Instead of finding someone difficult, they found someone who often carried burdens quietly without asking for recognition. These observations created confusion at first. They didn't immediately change their opinion. They simply created questions. Questions have power. Questions are often the first crack in a belief that no longer matches reality. The more they paid attention, the more those questions multiplied. Why did their experiences feel so different from the stories they had been told? Why did your actions reveal qualities nobody had mentioned? Why did reality seem to tell a completely different story? And listen to this. Once those questions appeared, they became impossible to silence. Every interaction with you added another piece to the puzzle. Every observation revealed another contradiction. Your soulmate began noticing patterns. They noticed that your kindness wasn't occasional, it was consistent. They noticed that your integrity wasn't something you displayed only when people were watching. It appeared repeatedly, even during moments when nobody would have known if you had chosen differently. They noticed your patience. They noticed your resilience. They noticed the way you continued moving forward despite difficulties. And your heart needs this right now because genuine character cannot stay hidden forever. Eventually, people see it. Eventually, actions speak louder than assumptions. Eventually, reality becomes stronger than rumors. That is exactly what was happening. The image they had been given was slowly being replaced by the image they were creating through their own experiences. At first, they tried to explain away the contradictions. They thought maybe they were missing something. Maybe there were details they didn't understand. Maybe there was another side to the story. But the more they looked, the harder it became to maintain those explanations. Every new experience pointed toward the same conclusion. The person they had been warned about wasn't the person standing in front of them. The real you was someone completely different. And listen to this. This realization wasn't comfortable. It forced them to confront an unsettling possibility. What if someone they trusted had been unfair? What if someone they respected had allowed personal feelings to influence their judgment? What if the narrative they had accepted wasn't based on truth at all? These questions lingered in their mind. They followed them into quiet moments. They appeared during ordinary days. They resurfaced whenever your name crossed their thoughts. The more they reflected, the more they remembered old conversations. Suddenly, comments that once seemed harmless felt different. Certain statements began standing out. Certain warnings no longer made sense. And your heart needs this right now because awareness changes everything. Once people begin noticing inconsistencies, they cannot unsee them. Once they recognize a pattern, they start seeing evidence of that pattern everywhere. Your soulmate had entered that stage. They started noticing how often negative assumptions had been attached to you. They started noticing how frequently your actions had been interpreted in the worst possible light. They started noticing how little attention had been given to your positive qualities. The imbalance became impossible to ignore. And listen to this, they weren't angry yet. They weren't ready to confront anyone. But they were beginning to lose confidence in the person who had influenced their perspective. Trust doesn't disappear all at once. It fades gradually. It weakens every time reality contradicts expectation. It erodes every time someone discovers they were not given the full truth. That process had already begun. Every observation strengthened their respect for you while simultaneously weakening their trust in the other person's judgment. The gap between perception and reality continued growing larger. Your soulmate found themselves thinking about you more often than before. Not because they were obsessed, but because they were trying to understand how such a major misunderstanding could have happened. They replayed memories. They reviewed conversations. They compared stories with experiences. Every comparison produced the same result. Reality won. Reality kept proving itself. Reality kept revealing someone whose character deserved respect. And your heart needs this right now because respect is powerful. Once genuine respect begins growing, it becomes difficult for negativity to survive. The more they respected you, the less willing they became to accept criticism without evidence. The more they admired your consistency, the more suspicious they became of the narratives they had once trusted. A turning point was approaching, even though they didn't realize it yet. Something inside them was shifting. The foundation of belief they once stood upon was beginning to crumble. The person who had influenced them for so long was slowly losing credibility. Not because of one dramatic event, but because truth kept showing up again and again. Every day brought another reminder. Every interaction added another layer of understanding. Every reflection moved them closer to a conclusion they had never expected to reach. And listen to this, by the end of this stage, your soulmate was no longer asking whether they had misunderstood you. They were asking whether someone else had deliberately misunderstood you first. That question changed everything. Because once it appeared, it opened a door that could never be closed. A door leading toward clarity, toward truth, and toward a decision that would eventually force them to choose between an old influence and the reality they had discovered for themselves. The choice had not yet been made, but the journey toward it had already begun. And with every step forward, your soulmate found themselves trusting their own observations more than the voices that had once guided them, bringing them closer and closer to a truth powerful enough to change everything. Listen carefully, because this is where everything begins to change, and your heart needs this right now. After all the questions that had started growing inside your soulmate's mind, they could no longer ignore what they were seeing. The confusion that once made them hesitate was slowly being replaced by clarity. For a long time, they had balanced two different realities. One reality was built from stories, opinions, and warnings they had heard from someone they trusted. The other reality was built from their own experiences with you. At first, they tried to keep both realities alive at the same time. They wanted to believe that everyone involved was being honest. They wanted to believe there was a reasonable explanation for every contradiction. But the deeper they looked, the harder that became. And listen to this, every time they interacted with you, they discovered something new that challenged the image they had been given. They noticed that your actions remained consistent no matter who was around. They noticed that you treated people with respect even when there was nothing to gain. They noticed that when misunderstandings happened, you didn't rush to create drama. Instead, you often chose patience, understanding, and maturity. These weren't isolated moments. These were patterns. And your heart needs this right now because patterns reveal truth more clearly than words ever can. The more they paid attention, the more they realized that the qualities they admired in people were the same qualities they kept finding in you. At the same time, they started paying closer attention to the person who had influenced their opinion in the first place. They began noticing things they had never noticed before. Small details. Small comments. Small reactions. Things that once seemed normal now felt different. Whenever something positive happened involving you, that person seemed uncomfortable. Whenever your name came up in a positive conversation, they quickly changed the subject or found a way to introduce doubt. Whenever someone complimented you, they seemed eager to explain why the compliment wasn't deserved. And listen to this, your soulmate couldn't ignore those moments anymore. What once seemed like harmless observations now felt intentional. What once sounded like concern now felt like criticism disguised as concern. The more they reflected on these interactions, the more they started wondering why someone would work so hard to shape another person's reputation. Was it jealousy? Was it insecurity? Was it resentment? They didn't know. But they could feel that something wasn't right. And your heart needs this right now because intuition often notices the truth before the mind is ready to accept it. Deep inside, your soulmate already knew what was happening. They just weren't ready to admit it yet. They still wanted to believe the best about everyone involved. They still hoped there was some misunderstanding that would explain everything. But every day brought more evidence. Every conversation revealed another contradiction. Every observation pushed them closer to the truth. There came a point when they started replaying old memories in their mind. Conversations they hadn't thought about in months suddenly returned. Warnings that once seemed important now sounded suspicious. Advice that once felt helpful now seemed manipulative. And listen to this, when they looked back with fresh eyes, they realized something shocking. Many of the negative opinions they had formed about you had never come from their own experiences. They had come from someone else's interpretation of events. Someone else had decided what they should think. Someone else had decided how they should feel. Someone else had quietly influenced their perception from the beginning. That realization hit harder than they expected. Because it wasn't just about you anymore. It was about trust. It was about realizing that someone they respected may not have been honest with them. And your heart needs this right now because discovering that kind of truth changes a person. It forces them to question assumptions they never thought they would question. It forces them to reevaluate relationships they once considered secure. It forces them to decide whether they value comfort or truth. Your soulmate found themselves standing at that crossroads. On one side was familiarity. On the other side was reality. For a while, they tried to avoid choosing. They hoped the situation would somehow resolve itself. They hoped the contradictions would disappear. But the truth kept growing louder. They could no longer ignore the respect they had developed for you. They could no longer pretend that their experiences matched the stories they had been told. And listen to this, one day, something happened that made everything impossible to ignore. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It wasn't a huge revelation. It was a simple moment where the person influencing them spoke negatively about you again. But this time, your soulmate knew better. This time, they had their own experiences to compare against those words. This time, they could see the exaggeration. They could hear the bias. They could recognize the unfairness. And for the first time, instead of silently accepting it, they questioned it internally. They thought about all the evidence that pointed in the opposite direction. They thought about your actions, your character, and the person they had actually come to know. In that moment, something shifted permanently. The spell of influence began breaking. The authority that person once held started fading. And your heart needs this right now because once people begin thinking for themselves, manipulation loses its power. Your soulmate started trusting their own judgment more than someone else's opinions. They started valuing first-hand experience over second-hand stories. They started recognizing that truth does not need constant defense because truth reveals itself naturally over time. As this awareness grew, they became more protective of their perception of you. They no longer allowed every negative comment to pass without question. They no longer accepted assumptions as facts. They no longer believed everything they were told. Instead, they looked for evidence. They looked for consistency. They looked for reality. And reality kept leading them back to the same conclusion. You were not the person they had been warned about. You were someone far more genuine, far more authentic, and far more deserving of respect than they had ever been led to believe. And listen to this, that realization created another feeling they weren't expecting, guilt. They began wondering how many times they had misunderstood you. They wondered how many unfair assumptions they had accepted without question. They wondered whether they had ever judged you based on information that wasn't true. Those thoughts stayed with them. They couldn't erase them. But they also couldn't change the past. The only thing they could do was learn from it. And that's exactly what they started doing. Every lesson brought more clarity. Every realization brought more understanding. Every day strengthened their belief that truth mattered more than comfort. By the end of this stage, your soulmate was no longer confused. They were no longer uncertain. The questions that had once haunted them were being replaced by answers. They now understood that the image they had been given of you was incomplete at best and unfair at worst. They understood that someone they trusted had played a major role in creating that false image. Most importantly, they understood that continuing to ignore the truth would mean betraying their own conscience. A decision was approaching, even if they hadn't fully admitted it yet. The distance between them and that other person was beginning to grow. Trust was weakening. Respect was fading. And with every new realization, your soulmate moved one step closer to making a choice that would change everything, for them, for their relationships, and for the future they were beginning to imagine. Listen carefully, because this is the moment when the situation becomes impossible for your soulmate to ignore, and your heart needs this right now. By now, the doubts they once pushed aside had grown into something much larger. The questions that first appeared as small concerns were no longer quiet whispers in the background of their mind. They had become impossible to silence. For weeks, maybe even months, your soulmate had been watching, observing, and comparing what they personally experienced with what they had been told. Every observation seemed to lead to the same conclusion. The version of you they had come to know through real-life interactions was completely different from the version someone had tried so hard to convince them existed. And listen to this. Once that realization settled into their heart, they found themselves looking at everything differently. Conversations they once accepted without question suddenly felt strange. Comments that once seemed harmless now carried a different meaning. They began noticing how often certain people focused on your flaws while ignoring your strengths. They noticed how quickly positive things about you were dismissed and how eagerly negative interpretations were accepted. The more they noticed these patterns, the more uncomfortable they became. Your soulmate wasn't the kind of person who enjoyed conflict. They didn't want drama. They didn't want arguments. They didn't want to believe someone they trusted could have been misleading them. But reality kept forcing them to face uncomfortable truths. And your heart needs this right now because there comes a point when people must choose between protecting an illusion and accepting reality. Your soulmate was approaching that point. Every day seemed to bring another moment that strengthened their respect for you. They saw your consistency. They saw your integrity. They saw how you handled situations when nobody was watching. Most importantly, they saw how different your actions were from the stories they had been told. And listen to this, consistency is powerful. Anyone can pretend for a day. Anyone can create a good impression for a week. But genuine character reveals itself over time. Your soulmate had been paying attention long enough to recognize that what they were seeing wasn't an act. It wasn't temporary. It wasn't something created for appearances. It was simply who you were. As this realization grew stronger, they began questioning the motivations of the person who had influenced them. Why had they worked so hard to create a negative impression? Why did they always seem uncomfortable whenever something positive happened involving you? Why did every conversation somehow return to criticism, doubt, or suspicion? At first, your soulmate tried to avoid these questions. They wanted to give everyone the benefit of the doubt. They wanted to believe there was a reasonable explanation. But every answer they came up with eventually fell apart. The facts didn't support the narrative anymore. The evidence pointed somewhere else entirely. And your heart needs this right now because truth becomes difficult to ignore when it appears repeatedly. The more your soulmate looked back, the more they realized how much influence that person had over their earlier opinions. It wasn't that they had been forced to think negatively about you. It was more subtle than that. Little comments. Small suggestions. Casual observations presented as facts. Over time, those things had shaped a perception. But now that perception was collapsing. Piece by piece, it was being replaced by direct experience. Your soulmate found themselves feeling frustrated. Not at you. Not even at the situation itself. They were frustrated with the realization that they had allowed someone else's voice to become louder than their own judgment. They were frustrated that they hadn't trusted their instincts sooner. They were frustrated that they had spent so much time believing things that no longer seemed true. And listen to this. That frustration slowly transformed into determination. They decided they were no longer going to rely on second-hand opinions. They were no longer going to let someone else tell them who deserved respect and who didn't. They were going to trust what they had personally witnessed. They were going to trust their own experiences. They were going to trust reality. That decision marked a major turning point. Because once they made it, everything else started changing. The person who once held influence over them began losing it. Every unfair comment damaged credibility. Every biased observation weakened trust. Every attempt to push a negative narrative made your soulmate more skeptical. Instead of accepting those comments automatically, they started questioning them. Instead of agreeing, they started analyzing. Instead of listening passively, they started thinking critically. And your heart needs this right now because awareness changes relationships. Once people begin seeing patterns clearly, they cannot pretend those patterns don't exist. Your soulmate was seeing things clearly for the first time. They began noticing that the negativity surrounding you wasn't really about you anymore. It seemed to reveal more about the person spreading it. The bitterness. The jealousy. The insecurity. The need to control perceptions. Whatever the reason was, your soulmate could sense that it wasn't healthy. They could sense that it wasn't fair. They could sense that it wasn't honest. This realization brought sadness along with clarity. Because nobody enjoys discovering that someone they trusted may not have had good intentions. Nobody enjoys realizing that a relationship was built on incomplete truths. Yet that was exactly what was happening. The more they understood, the harder it became to maintain the same level of trust they once had. And listen to this, trust rarely disappears all at once. It fades gradually. It weakens every time someone discovers another inconsistency. It erodes every time reality contradicts what they have been told. By this stage, that process was well underway. Your soulmate found themselves creating emotional distance without even realizing it. They shared less. They listened differently. They became more cautious about accepting information at face value. Something had shifted permanently. The relationship they once had with that person was no longer the same. At the same time, their respect for you continued growing. Every new observation reinforced what they already suspected. You weren't perfect, because nobody is. But you were genuine. You were honest. You were consistent. And those qualities mattered far more than the exaggerated flaws they had heard about. Your soulmate began appreciating things about you they might have overlooked before. Your resilience. Your kindness. Your ability to stay true to yourself even when others misunderstood you. Those qualities stood out more clearly than ever. And your heart needs this right now because admiration often grows strongest when it is discovered through experience rather than persuasion. Nobody had convinced your soulmate to respect you. They arrived at that conclusion on their own. That made it stronger. That made it real. As this chapter came to a close, one thing became impossible to deny. A decision was approaching. Your soulmate could feel it. They knew they couldn't continue pretending everything was normal. They knew they couldn't ignore the growing gap between truth and influence. They knew they couldn't maintain the same level of trust in someone whose words no longer matched reality. The conflict was reaching its peak. The questions had been answered. The patterns had been revealed. The truth had become clear. All that remained was deciding what to do about it. And although they had not yet completely cut that person out of their life, the emotional separation had already begun. Deep inside, your soulmate understood that some relationships survive the truth and some do not. The one they were now questioning was about to face its biggest test, and the outcome would change everything. Listen carefully, because this is the chapter where everything reaches a turning point, and your heart needs this right now. By now, your soulmate was no longer struggling to see the truth. The confusion that once clouded their judgment had faded. The doubts that once made them hesitate had been replaced by clarity. For a long time, they had tried to balance loyalty to someone they trusted with the reality they were witnessing for themselves. They wanted to believe everyone involved had good intentions. They wanted to believe the contradictions could somehow be explained. But the more they observed, the more impossible that became. Every experience they had with you continued pointing in the same direction. Every interaction revealed another reason to respect you. Every moment confirmed what their heart had already begun accepting. And listen to this, when truth becomes strong enough, it reaches a point where it can no longer coexist with illusion. One of them eventually wins. In your soulmate's case, reality was winning. The image they had once accepted about you had almost completely disappeared. In its place stood a very different understanding. They now saw someone who was genuine, someone who remained kind even when misunderstood, someone who continued moving forward despite challenges, and someone whose character spoke louder than any rumor ever could. That realization changed the way they viewed everything around them. Suddenly, conversations they once ignored seemed significant. Reactions they once dismissed began standing out. They noticed how uncomfortable a certain person became whenever you were mentioned positively. They noticed how quickly compliments directed toward you were challenged. They noticed how often innocent situations were twisted into negative interpretations. At first, these observations made your soulmate uncomfortable. But eventually, they made something else happen. They made your soulmate angry. Not because of anything you had done, but because they were beginning to realize how unfairly you had been treated. Your heart needs this right now because there comes a moment when people stop questioning whether something is wrong and start questioning why it has been allowed to continue for so long. Your soulmate had reached that moment. They started looking back over months of conversations and interactions. The more they reflected, the more they realized how much influence that person had once held over their perspective. It wasn't obvious influence. It wasn't direct manipulation. It was subtle. It happened through repeated suggestions, carefully chosen words, and constant negative framing. Little by little, a false narrative had been built. And listen to this, once they recognized that pattern, they couldn't stop seeing it. Every memory seemed to reveal another example. Every recollection exposed another attempt to shape their opinion. It became impossible to ignore. They started asking themselves difficult questions. Why had someone worked so hard to create doubt about you? What benefit did they gain from it? Why did they seem threatened whenever the truth about you became visible? The answers weren't immediately clear, but one thing was obvious: the behavior wasn't healthy. It wasn't fair. And it certainly wasn't honest. As these realizations grew stronger, your soulmate began changing the way they responded. Instead of accepting criticism about you, they started challenging it internally. Instead of automatically agreeing with negative comments, they compared those comments to reality. And reality kept winning. Every single time. That process slowly weakened the authority that person once held over them. What had once been influence became suspicion. What had once been trust became doubt. What had once been certainty became a question mark. And your heart needs this right now because relationships depend on trust. Once trust starts breaking, everything else follows. The person who had spent so much time shaping your soulmate's perception didn't realize what was happening. They continued behaving the same way. They continued making the same comments. They continued trying to control the narrative. But something had changed. Your soulmate was no longer listening the way they used to. They were paying attention to the motives behind the words. They were noticing inconsistencies. They were recognizing patterns that had once gone unseen. And listen to this, awareness is powerful because it removes the effectiveness of manipulation. Once people understand what is happening, the tactics stop working. That is exactly where your soulmate found themselves. They were becoming immune to the influence that once guided them. Every attempt to create doubt about you only strengthened their belief that they had been misled. Every negative remark only made them more protective of the truth. Every unfair judgment only increased their respect for you. This created tension inside them. They didn't like conflict. They didn't enjoy confrontation. But they also couldn't ignore what they now knew. Deep down, they understood they were approaching a decision. A relationship built on trust can survive disagreements. It can survive misunderstandings. It can survive mistakes. But it struggles to survive repeated dishonesty. And your heart needs this right now because your soulmate was starting to question whether honesty had ever truly existed in that relationship. They began creating distance. At first, it was emotional distance. They shared fewer personal thoughts. They became less open. They stopped seeking advice from the person they once trusted. Then came mental distance. They no longer viewed that person's opinions as facts. They no longer accepted their interpretations automatically. They started thinking independently. They started trusting their own judgment. They started valuing their own experiences more than someone else's narrative. And listen to this, that shift was huge. It marked the moment your soulmate fully stepped out from under another person's influence. For the first time, they were seeing everything through their own eyes. The result was undeniable. The more independent their thinking became, the clearer the truth appeared. They realized that you had never been the problem they were warned about. If anything, you had been one of the most misunderstood people in the situation. They realized that your actions consistently reflected qualities they admired. They realized that your character had remained steady despite being judged unfairly. Most importantly, they realized that someone had tried very hard to prevent them from discovering those truths. That realization changed the emotional dynamic completely. What once felt like loyalty now felt misplaced. What once felt like trust now felt naive. What once felt like friendship now felt questionable. Your soulmate wasn't rushing toward a decision, but they could feel themselves moving closer to one every day. The emotional bond they once had with that person was weakening rapidly. Respect was fading. Confidence was disappearing. Patience was running out. And listen to this, every relationship eventually reveals its true foundation. Some foundations are built on honesty, mutual respect, and trust. Others are built on control, insecurity, and hidden motives. Your soulmate was beginning to see which foundation existed beneath the relationship they were questioning. The discovery was painful, but it was also liberating. For the first time in a long time, they felt aligned with their own conscience. They felt like they were finally honoring the truth instead of avoiding it. They felt like they were making decisions based on reality rather than influence. That feeling brought a sense of peace, even as it brought discomfort. Because growth often feels uncomfortable before it feels freeing. As this chapter came to an end, one thing became certain. The relationship they were questioning could not continue exactly as it had before. Too much had been revealed. Too much trust had been lost. Too much truth had come to light. The distance between them was no longer temporary. It was becoming permanent. Your soulmate knew a final choice was approaching. They knew they would soon have to decide whether someone who repeatedly distorted the truth deserved a place in their future. The answer was becoming clearer every day. And while the final separation had not happened yet, the emotional decision had already begun taking shape inside their heart. The truth about you had opened their eyes, and once eyes are opened, they rarely close again. The next step would be the hardest one of all, the moment when your soulmate finally chooses truth over familiarity and decides whether that person still belongs in their life.